The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today we are broadcasting from Powderham Castle with a special guest, Charlie Courtenay, Earl of Devon. Charlie, welcome.
Welcome. Well, welcome to Powderham. It's very nice to have you here, and thank you for coming.
This is a beautiful, beautiful home, and we toured it before we just sat down here with you. I have so many questions to ask you. But the one that comes to mind first is, what does it mean to you to be the Earl of Devon?
It means a fair amount of work, a remarkable opportunity and privilege to play a role that the family has been playing for nearly 900 years. Yeah. And I actually had the opportunity recently to play that role within the House of Lords, to actually take a legislative role in the UK Parliament. And for me, it's been really, really interesting. I'm a historian, an amateur historian. I find the stories interesting. And it's really, to me, fascinating to see how within our modern parliamentary system, there's still a role for the hereditary peerage and for these old family titles.
So what period of history do you enjoy the most?
All 1,000 years that we cover. I was a bit of an early modernist. In the past, I studied quite intensely the Tudors at one stage, but I'm also an art historian. Oh. And Powderham has, as you can see from the walls here, quite a lot of Georgian Regency work. And so from an art history perspective, I've always been fascinated by that time when England really was preeminent in the creation of decorative arts in particular, and studied Reynolds and Hudson and Cosway and all the great artists that came from Devon.
Wow. Can we talk about when you first walk into the castle and you take a left into that beautiful, I think it's a Victorian room.
Yes.
The giant painting that you see. I've never seen a painting that large in my entire life. What can you tell me about that one?
Yeah, so that's a family, really a family photograph, as it were, from the time, painted by Thomas Hudson, who was a Devon-born artist and really one of the preeminent artists of his day, of the first Viscount Courtenay and his family. And it's a very grand, very, very grand image on a large scale, but it really shows the family in a domestic space. And you've got mum and dad, you've got the kids playing with their dogs and with their and with their sort of ride-on vehicles and such. And it's kind of, in that sense, it's a really intimate family shot, but it's obviously painted on a very grand scale. What's always fascinated me is that painting was obviously commissioned for a space in this house, but that wall wasn't there when it was built or when it was painted, because the dining room wasn't built until sort of 1840s. So where was that picture painted to hang? And I'm sort of trying to work out, because I'd quite like to move it about at some point.
It is large.
It's a large
do you know
piece.
The dimensions of it?
No, but it's a good 12 feet tall and probably 18 feet wide. And what's also really interesting about it, and the painting of that day is there's a real focus on fabric and the sort of wealth and presentation of the family, but also on elegance and pose. And you see very much in the figure of the son, who is front and center of the family grouping. He's got very elongated arms and legs, and he's looking very sort of elegant. And there was a whole language of figure at the time that picture is really replete with. And Dad, who's sitting in a chair behind, is slightly uncomfortable with having to sit down for the portrait, and you can very much tell that. And Mum has her hand firmly on his shoulder, saying, "No, you stay here. We're going to get this damn picture painted, if you like it or not." But that family was fascinating. They were very much responsible for the domestication of this ancient castle, and they're celebrating that picture.
I think the thing about paintings is it's so much more than just looking at the people in them, isn't it?
Yeah,
There's just so much symbolism and all different kinds of
things. Lots of layers of meaning. But at its core, very much as Powderham is at its core a family home, it's a family picture. And that's what I love about it, and having the connection with all of those sort of pictures and paintings around the house and the objects. They all have a particular meaning within this space that is lost when you transplant them and move them elsewhere.
Right. My favorite part of this beautiful home is the books. Can we talk about your book collection?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting library, and quite an extensive library. We have three, well, arguably five libraries. You have the first and second library. You had the anteroom, which has a remarkable pair of bookcases made by another local artist called John Channon, a cabinet maker from Exeter in the 1740s. Really the most sumptuous pair of English Baroque bookcases. And then you have the North Tower, where all of the secret books are hidden, and upstairs a Channon library, which is less full of books now. And there was very much this process or desire of that family and the generation that followed to display their knowledge and their reading and their learning through the exhibition of their books in a library. And it was quite cutting edge at the time. Probably nowadays you'd compare it to your search history on Google or whatever. It's like, this is what we know, this is what we learn, this is how we learn it. And the collection of books, goes back a while, and they had some rather wonderful medieval manuscripts, all the way through the sort of, the development of modern learning, and there's lots of work on science, lots of work on travel, lots of work of literature, etc. And what I've always found quite fascinating is also it's a domestic space. The second Viscount had 13 daughters and one son, and it's a domestic space in which the daughters of the house are getting an education too, which was quite a radical idea at the time, but one that sort of enabled female learning. You could do it in this space because it was a private home, and we had access to the books.
One of the books, I love to collect old books, and of course in America it's a little bit harder to get our hands on old ones.
Yeah,
we usually have to go online and order them. But I kept looking at the spines and trying to find interesting titles, and one of them that I saw was The Works of Charles I.
Yes, yeah.
And I thought, how cool is that?
So there's lots of reflection on history. The family is quite historic. We have our own lengthy history, and you can very much see in the collection, you can see what the family was reflecting upon and the issues that were of interest to them. There were quite a few clerics in the family, so there's quite a lot of collected sermons. And then you have a wonderful history of the French Revolution written, or sort of eyewitness account of the French Revolution written in the 1790s, obviously annotated by the third Viscount, who was living here at the time, effectively watching this Republican Revolution happen in real time. And you sort of see how they're sort of following it and understanding it and trying to understand what it means, for English aristocracy. And it would have been quite a febrile time. And obviously America had recently had its own revolution and dealt with us as it did. And there's a really interesting adjunct to that, which is the third Viscount William, the brother of those 13 sisters, whose paintings are actually on the wall behind us. He went on to acquire for his music room that he built in 1792 the official French portrait from the French embassy of Louis XVI. So the king had just been beheaded, and William, we are French, our family is French, Courtenay is a French name. William, this young French aristocrat, buys the portrait of the beheaded French king and hangs it in his music room opposite himself, which was quite a sort of statement of intent to the Republicans, saying, bring it on, perhaps. He's a fascinating character.
As far as books go, is there one in here that stands out the most to you?
There's one really fascinating. Well, there were two fascinating books, one of which sadly my father sold, which are medieval texts. And they were actually in the Devon Records Office, and we really didn't know that we didn't know we owned them. And one was this book called the Courtenay Compendium, which was a compendium of travel stories that had been collected by the monks of Ford Abbey. Ford Abbey was an ancient Cistercian foundation on the Devon-Dorset border that was founded by the family or predecessors of ours in about 1120, 1130, the de Brion family. Anyway, these monks had collected all these travel stories around Scandinavia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and it also included the oldest account of Marco Polo's journey to Xanadu. And so here you have these monks of the sort of 1300s reflecting upon the challenges of doing trade with China, which is exactly what the Americans and the Europeans are dealing with today.
Yes.
And life does not move on very far, and having access to these wonderful old records really allows us to reflect upon, we don't move forward very much. And then the other book that we also unearthed at the same time was a cartulary, which I have in my office, which is a book of charters dating from about the same time, about from 1340 to about 1400. And it's a book of accounts of the family estates and land and charters, basically showing your ownership of the various manors that the family owned at the time. And that was the sort of height of the family's land holdings in the southwest of England. And it was designed to pass from father to son on inheritance. And of course, I discovered that we owned it shortly after my father died. I took a telephone call from the auction house at Sotheby's saying, would you like your cartulary back, Lord Devon? And it was like, what's a cartulary? And why? Because they'd obviously taken it away to value it, consider it. And so I got this book back, and since then we've had an amazing time translating it, scanning it. We've worked with the Exeter University Digital Humanities Laboratory, and they've done lots of digital scans of it, and they've used it to teach students how to read ancient medieval texts. But also it contains really quite humdrum histories or quite interesting histories of all the towns that the family would have founded during that period. And so it's suddenly become a real resource for local history and local knowledge. And we learned that Ken Ford, was founded because the family owned the village of Ken. The main road from Exeter to Plymouth went about 2 miles up the road from Ken. So they built a new town at Ken Ford so that they could take advantage of the trade that passes along the road. And similarly at Colcombe or Collerton in East Devon. And so you find about all these founding stories of these old communities around the county, which is really useful. And it has a wonderful, at the front of the book, wonderfully illustrated family tree, which shows the family in 1300s very much associating themselves with the Norman conquest in ways that we don't in our modern telling of our story. We see ourselves as Plantagenet Angevin French, who came over with Eleanor of Aquitaine. But back in those days, it was important that we'd married into these Norman conquering families, the de Redvers and the de Brion families, and those were the guys that we were very much telling the stories of. And reflecting, it's oddly, it's one of the earliest family trees in one of the earliest private family trees in Europe. It's, wasn't something that was done at the time. People didn't reflect upon their heritage in quite the way that obviously people do now with the Ancestry.com, etc. And it was quite rare for a private family to link itself back through generations. The royal family did it, and obviously you see it in the Bible with the kings of Israel, etc. But it was not something that typically was done in a private house. So it was interesting that the family was doing it to link themselves back to these sort of ancient families and try and establish a sort of significance within the county, which still, slightly runs through to this day.
Did you have any idea as a young man what your family name meant?
Yes, I was always interested in it. I still don't know really what it means, but I know that it's, it's a really interesting survivor. It provides a nice long timeline. As I say, you pick up Athon in 1000 AD. He sort of appears in the history books, and there aren't many that sort of cling on like limpets like we do in this house. There's a lovely digression. Edward Gibbon wrote the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is a wonderful early history book of Europe from the Romans onwards through the Middle Ages. And he has this really lovely digression on the Courtenay family, sort of explaining how this family sort of appears early in history and then goes in many different directions to Constantinople, where they became emperors and kings of Jerusalem, and in France, where they kind of fell out of favour, and then a branch of the family moved to England, which is where we back in the 1760s when he was writing that history, at that time it was like, God, they're still here, and 250 years later, bloody hell, they're still here, and we carry on. It's it's a really interesting story, and one that I really enjoy sharing and allowing others to reflect upon and learn from.
So the Courtenay name is one that I really have not discussed much on my podcast. And yesterday we were at Wolf Hall Weekend.
Yes.
And we were talking about the Exeter conspiracy. And I'm hoping for my listeners, you can kind of explain it to them.
Yes. It's, this context that we're talking about of the ancientness of the lineage is what always gets the family into trouble. And in the Exeter conspiracy, the Courtenay family, which had been in Devon for centuries and at various times had sort of been proximate to, but never really involved in the sort of national political story. Suddenly they get very involved because we end up marrying the daughter of King Edward the Fourth, the last Plantagenet king, Catherine, and her sister marries Henry VII, and so instantly we're within the sort of close Tudor family. Henry VIII therefore becomes king, and his first cousin is Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter, or he creates him the Marquis of Exeter. And so they're close childhood friends. And, when Henry is young, King Henry is young, Henry, the Marquis of Exeter, is one of his great friends, and he jousts for him at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. I think he's designated to be his successor should Henry die without male issue, because he's obviously a cousin and he has that Plantagenet blood that was so valued. But then as things develop, Henry Courtenay becomes something of a threat, and certainly as soon as Henry VIII himself has a son, then Henry Courtenay is a challenge because he is possibly an alternate for the throne. Thomas Cromwell identifies this risk, and there's I think the history books are unclear as to whether it's concocted or whether there is some real basis to it, that Henry Courtenay is somehow plotting to overthrow Henry. This is obviously after the Reformation, and effectively to take the throne himself, or in concert with others. There's another family called the Pole family, who are second cousins of the king, who are also an old Plantagenet family with Catholic sympathies. And so the Exeter conspiracy takes place really during the years 1538, 1539. And they set about identifying this family as a potential risk, plotting treasonously against the king. I think they get tried in November 1539, and Henry the Marquis of Exeter is beheaded Tower Hill on a cold December morning in 1539. And one of the mottos that we bear is a Latin motto, ubi lapsus quid feci, which means where have I fallen, what have I done, which was written by poor Henry Courtenay on the walls of the Tower of London shortly before his beheading. And, having been such a sort of preeminent man of court, his downfall was very sudden, very brutal, and very vicious. Henry VIII was taking no prisoners at that time.
It was such a dangerous time to be of royal blood, to be so near the throne. And we see that with Margaret Pole as well, don't we?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is the Tudors have always been insecure about their lineage and their right to rule, and they very much sort of played two sides. So they relied upon these old Plantagenet families to get them into power.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the Courtenays were very involved during the succession of the Tudors. We accompanied Henry Tudor off to France. Bishop Peter Courtenay, who was the Bishop of Exeter and latterly Bishop of Winchester, crowned Henry VII at Winchester Cathedral. If you went into the dining room here, you'll have noticed a very ornate medieval style fireplace.
Yes.
That is modelled on Bishop Peter Courtenay's amazing fireplace at the Bishop's Palace in
Really?
Exeter Cathedral. And the Bishop's Palace in Exeter has this wonderful baronial fireplace with coats of arms all over it. And it's the first place in English iconography that you see the Tudor rose, so the white and the red rose combined.
So you had spoken previously about all the properties as well that your family has owned. And I just stayed at Tiverton Castle the last 2 nights.
That was our best castle.
It was.
Yeah.
What other places did you have?
Well, so we started, obviously in France, we had a wonderful chateau called Chateau Renard, which was on the edge of the town of Courtenay. And that's why Athon took the name Courtenay, because he fortified the town in about 1000 AD. But when we moved to England, we first lived in Oxfordshire, a place called Wootton Courtenay on the River Thames. But quite quickly we moved to Devon and were planted, as it were, in Oakhampton Castle, which was a fabulous Norman Motte and Bailey castle that still stands in sort of ruinous form. Is really worth a visit if anyone sort of wants to come to Devon, because it's a proper medieval fortress. And that's where the Courtenays established themselves, really with a view to defending the western reaches of the Plantagenet Empire from the marauding Cornish, who were never quite tamed and still aren't. And then we, as I said, began to marry these distinguished noble families in Devon, the Redvers family, and acquired Tiverton Castle through that. Nearby to Tiverton Castle was Bickley Castle, which we owned for a couple of hundred years. There's a lovely castle at Plympton down in Plymouth that was an important fortification that we owned. And obviously Exeter Castle was the sort of main castle where actually the earldom of Devon was forged when Baldwin de Redvers raised his standard in support of the Empress Matilda. So we were there at one point too. And oddly, Powderham, where we are now, is really one of the latest acquisitions of the family. We acquired the manor of Powderham when we married this amazing woman, Margaret de Bowen, in 1325, so nearly 700 years ago. And she brought with her the manor of Powderham as part of her dowry, and then set about, she disposed of it, not to her eldest son, who obviously was due to be the Earl living at Tiverton, but to her sixth son, Sir Philip, and he built the castle, which is why we're a sort of cadet branch of the main family, which is why we survived and didn't get beheaded like all the other ones did.
You stayed safe.
Yeah, we kept our noses clean and kept out of trouble.
I'm actually going to Devon tomorrow. Does that castle still stand?
Exeter?
Or Plymouth.
Plymouth.
Yes.
Yeah,
sorry.
Plympton. I don't think Plympton still stands, but I imagine, because it's, again, one of those Norman Motte and Baileys, I think there probably will be a something of it. But I've never been down there. Yeah. Be worth visiting.
So many great places.
And actually Devon has this really nice sequence of castles, and it's very your audience probably will know the Game of Thrones series,
yes.
which is obviously based quite closely actually on the English Wars of the Roses. And you very much see that played out amongst these Courtenay castles in Devon, because we were very much the power brokers at the time in the southwest. And you know, there was a time in the mid 1450s when the Earl of Devon, who lived at Tiverton, was being challenged for primacy in the county by the Bonville family of East Devon, a place called Chute. And they teamed up with us, the Powderham Courtenays, to challenge the Earl for supremacy. And we had a big battle at Clyst Heath, which is just next to Exeter, where the rugby club currently stands. And we lost, but we retired to Powderham and managed to sue for peace. But it was very much like, you know, the Battle of the Bastards. It's one of the last private battles on English soil where private families could raise an army and fight each other for local control. And obviously, after Bosworth and the centralisation that the Tudors managed to deploy across the whole country, those kind of private enmities fell away, and everybody became a servant of the crown. But prior to that, you know, you could have enough power in the southwest of England to almost ignore what was going on in the centre of government.
You know, after the death of Elizabeth I, is it possible the Courtenays were looking for the throne?
I don't know. There's a wonderful piece of evidence in the Library of Congress's collection, actually, which is a wonderful letter written from a Catholic spy whose name escapes me. I was trying to think of it yesterday, but it's a really wonderful name, so you have to find it up and let your listeners know. But he writes to King Philip of Spain, saying, "Dear King Philip, should this, dodgy Protestant queen die without sorting out her succession, and should you wish to invade and return England to the true faith, you could do much worse than land in Devon and go and have tea with Sir William Courtenay at Powderham. And once you get him on side, the southwest will be yours, and that way you can make your way into the country." We might have had aspirations to return the country to its original faith. Sir William was actually quite well known at the time as being, a man of quite local significance, but be a man of considerable Catholic sympathy. And it's quite interesting that 100 years later, almost exactly 100 years after the Spanish Armada failed to invade successfully, the Dutch succeeded, and William of Orange landed at Torbay in 1688 at the Glorious Revolution, and he chose to come and have tea with Sir William Courtenay at Ford House, which is where we were living at the time. And his first night on English soil was spent as a guest of ours, albeit Sir William apparently made sure he was not resident at the time, just in case the Glorious Revolution didn't work out. But obviously it did work out. And it's sort of nice to have that involvement in these parts of our history, but it also is a reminder that Devon and the southwest of England is the naughty way into the country.
Mm-hmm.
We're a long way from London, and central control doesn't really extend down here, and yet we're quite close to Europe, and we have strong trading ties with Holland and with the south of France and with Portugal and Spain. And so there's lots of flow of information, of knowledge. We talked earlier about books, and that there is lots of information that comes in and out, particularly the ex-estuary, which Powderham is right next to. And I love to use that story to remind the southwest of England that we're where modern, radical, quite challenging thought comes and goes from this country without necessarily being edited by the palace of or the court of St. James and central authority. So. And we're trying to work on that to this day.
I think there's something to be said for the fact that the Courtenay name in the family line is still here. The Tudor line died out with Elizabeth I.
Yes.
So your family knew how to survive.
Yeah, we persevered. There's a lovely portrait actually, which you might know, of Edward, who was Henry the Marquess of Exeter. Obviously, gets beheaded in 1539. His wonderful wife Gertrude manages to negotiate that she survives, and so does her son Edward, who's only 12 at the time. But Edward is obviously a high risk to the Tudors, so he is locked up in court, or in the Tower of London rather, and spends most of his youth as a prisoner in the Tower, alongside his cousins Mary and Elizabeth. And when Mary becomes queen in 1553, one of the first things she does is release Edward from prison and recreate him Earl of Devon, and the title that I hold, and the 19th Earl of Devon, of the 5th creation. And it's that creation. So I'm the 19th from 1553. And in celebration, Edward gets this amazing portrait painted, which he's standing there sort of fiery red hair with a big codpiece, looking very proud and strong. And behind him is this wonderful crumbling castle. And out of the crumbling castle is growing a little green shoot. And obviously the indication from the artist is this is the green shoot of recovery of this great old family's sort of lineage. Sadly, that doesn't come to fruition because he dies quite soon after in Italy. Suspiciously, although as I was told yesterday by the world expert that it probably was just the bad sewerage in Italy that killed him. But us as the cadet branch, planted by Margaret de Bowen at Powderham, were able to lie low for a couple of 100 years and then sort of reassert the right to the ancient title. And so we're still here, plodding along, doing our bit, and almost treasuring that narrative and that story and that continuity. And really, one of the things I really enjoy is sharing it, curating it, making sure that we're looking after the treasures and things like the cartulary and sharing them with academics and allowing people in to look about.
I really enjoyed discussing this with you today. I do want to end maybe with this beautiful home here. My favorite place in the whole building is the staircase.
Yes.
The beautiful, I don't even know what color to call it, turquoise.
Powderham blue.
I could not stop staring at it. It is so beautiful.
Yeah, it's a fabulous space.
It is.
One of the most interesting things about it is that it's a remodel, because that is the medieval Great Hall. So when it was built, it was just a big sort of fabulous dining space. When the family domesticated the house in the 1700s, they needed obviously a staircase that you could wear your big silk gown to walk down, and they commissioned that staircase with its amazing Rococo plasterwork. And as I mentioned earlier, we have excellent local artists such as Thomas Hudson, excellent local cabinet makers like John Channon, clockmakers like William Stumbles, but the plasterer himself came from Exeter, a chap called John Jenkins. And so you get this fabulous Rococo plasterwork that really is, probably some of the greatest Rococo interiors in England, done by an Exeter craftsman. And that's what's so lovely about Powderham, is it really extols the amazing ability of local artists and craftsmen. And it's also famous for a movie called Remains of the Day that was filmed here, and that staircase has a very poignant role in the film, which is rather nice.
I love that staircase. What's your favorite place?
So I always struggle with what's my favorite place, because what I love about Powderham is its many different characteristics. It's having been an art historian, I've really always had a thing for the Gothic, and what Powderham does is it's a mock Gothic family home that shows you every era of the Gothic. So you've obviously got the original 1390s building with the Great Hall and the three arches, but then you go all the way through the Georgian period, through the Regency period, into the Victorian period, and you've got a little bit of everything there. I think the most fabulous room is the music room, built by the third Viscount for his 21st birthday, which is sumptuous, with a wonderful big dome and amazing sculptures and urns, and is a great space for entertaining.
Is that the room that you would choose to just have a sit in?
Yeah, sometimes you go through and sit there. It's a nice place to, when we had the kids here at Christmas, to have a family dance and a party, and it's really, really great space.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Charlie, thank you so much for taking
No, well, thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure to meet you.
Well, this has been such a pleasure to meet with you and to see this beautiful home in the grounds as well.
Well, do come back, and we have strong ties with America generally, and it's always nice to welcome Americans to Devon.
Thank you.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.